All right. Hi, everyone. Good morning. I hope you're having a pleasant Sunday morning. And thank you very much for tuning in again for the second part of the teachings on how to work with fear. Last time we did a first teaching, and I will give a little summary about what we spoke about. But maybe before we go there, we take a minute to set up a positive motivation for being here, for listening to the teachings, for reflecting on the teachings, so that we make sure that whatever we are doing now, that becomes a cause for us to find liberation, find enlightenment, but definitely whatever, which one of the two it is, it doesn't really matter, but that we find a happiness, which is of a quality that goes beyond the happiness that we can experience within the desire realm where we are at the moment. So maybe to set up the motivation, we take a minute to bring our awareness inside. To maybe you close your eyes, you become mindful of your body, of the place where you're sitting. And when the mind is aware of the body, then the mind is automatically in the present moment. And when the mind is in the present moment, delusions cannot arise. And so the mind can become calm and clear. And so for the mind to become calm and clear, we only need to be present. Present with the body. Some people like to be present with breath. Or present with the mind. And then we can set up a good motivation. And a good motivation means that we're gonna listen to the teachings, not just for our own sake, but whatever benefit is gonna come from being here today, from listening to the teachings, from reflecting on it, from getting deeper insights into fear and what it does to the mind. We think, may this become a cause for me to achieve liberation from samsara. And not only that, but may it also become a cause for me to attain full enlightenment, which is a state in which we have developed all the good qualities that can be developed, and in which we have abandoned or eliminated all the negative qualities. And in order to attain that state, we can't attain that just for our own benefit. The only way that we can attain that state of full enlightenment is when we do that for the benefit of all sentient beings. Having recognized that they are all suffering from the same things as we are suffering from. And having recognized that all sentient beings want to be happy in the same way as that we want to be happy. And so just as we want to be free of all suffering and want to attain happiness, that's what all sentient beings want. And so instead of just working for our own liberation, we decide that we're going to work for the liberation of all suffering, of all sentient beings. And so in order to attain that state of full enlightenment, we need to rely upon our objects of refuge. We need to know, we need like a guide that is going to show us where to go. And so our objects of refuge are the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. Buddha being our own potential to become a Buddha, so our own future Buddhahood, which is represented by our teachers who we envision they already have attained Buddhahood. It is also represented by the historical Buddha, Buddha Shakyamuni. It is also represented by the images of the Buddha. That is our main object of refuge. And we take refuge in the Dharma by taking refuge in all the teachings of the Buddha, written or the teachings that we are hearing. But even more important than that is in all the positive actions that we are doing, because they all become a cause for that Buddhahood. They are a collection of qualities in the mind that we collect in order to achieve that Buddhahood. And now we take refuge in the Sangha, which is the Sangha member that we become when we attain full enlightenment, but also everyone around us having that same potential, having that same intent. They all become, in the future, ultimate objects of Sangha refuge. And so then we can take refuge together. And you can see it on the screen. And we can do that twice in Tibetan and one time in English. Sangye chedan sangye chonam la chanchu badu dani kyapsuchi ndage chenye gipe sonam gi drola penchi sangye rupa shung. Sangye chedan sangye chonam la chanchu badu dani kyapsuchi ndage chenye gipe sonam gi Drola penchia sange rupashu. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. So last time we spoke about fear and what is fear. And I said that we will go through the aspects of fear by following the Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths are seen as a way that a doctor assesses his patient. You know, the patient comes and said, I'm having this and this problem. And then the doctor first wants to really understand, what is your disease? What are you actually suffering from? So last time we spoke about fear and we went into all the aspects of what is fear exactly, so that we can identify with fear when it arises in the mind. When strong fear arises in the mind, it's quite easy. We immediately feel it, right? We know it. Oh, this is fear. We can feel it in the body. We can feel it as sensations in the body. We can feel, you know, sometimes it hits you in your stomach, and maybe your stomach is turning around, or, you know, oh, I'm so scared. But sometimes fear is more subtle. So we need to really find like, oh, this is fear, this is fear, this is fear. Then when we know that, then we can wonder, okay, what is the cause of fear? And when the fear has causes, we can do something about the causes in order to do something about the fear, right? And I think we made a small beginning with the causes. So today we will go further with that. And when we know that there are causes of fear, then we can say, okay, can I eliminate these causes of fear? And how can I do that? And so that is the truth of cessation and the truth of the path. So last week, how we spoke about fear is that we looked into fear that we experience, and we compare that with how animals experience fear. And there is something unique about the way human beings experience fear, right? I hope you can remember that, but I'll go a little bit over that as well. So what is fear? Fear itself is part of any unpleasant feeling that we can experience. When fear arises in the mind, it is something specific. There is something specific about fear. We can recognize that there are many unpleasant feelings, but when it is fear, we recognize it. And I'm not sure about you, but I think the main distinguishing feature of fear within all the unpleasant feelings that we have is that fear triggers that self-grasping mind. The self comes up, you know, me, the self, the I feels threatened. And so in a way, when that fear gets triggered, we as human beings have a similar reactions than animals who experience fear. When fear arises, for instance, when an animal is hunted, the animal tries to get away, runs away, or fights. There is the fight and the flight reaction. And so we as human beings have that too, right? The fight and the flight reaction. Then when the fear is, the danger is gone, for instance, a lion is hunting a deer. The moment the deer can escape, what the animal does, it stands still. And then after some time, you see that the body starts shaking. And so the animal is shaking off the fear. Then it is kind of resetting its nerve system. So what do we do as human beings when there is this threat to our existence? For instance, last time I used the example, I'm crossing the street and this truck is coming and I see it late, but I jump quickly back, you know. Then when I'm on the walkway, the threat is gone, but the body is still shaking. I'm still scared, you know. Then I need to do something in order to release that fear. I might have to scream, I might have to shake my body, I might have to tell the story 10 times to people in order to release that fear. And then once the fear is released, it is gone, and I move on with my life. Right, so this is what we have in common with animals. So when an unpleasant feeling arises in the mind, like fear, then the mind reacts with aversion. Whether that is fight and flight reaction, or if we want to fight or flight, but we can't, we might freeze, you know. These are all ways that that aversion to the threat manifests. And so the difference that we have between between human beings and animals is that animals only react to the threat that is happening in the here and now. Right? The fear only arises when there is a threat to that physical body. So we also have that reaction, but we have many more reactions. Fear can arise in so many more ways in human beings. For instance, even when our life is not directly in a threat, you know, but when we hear stories about, oh, something is coming, we already feel the fear. Nothing is happening in our day-to-day life, but we hear some danger is coming. We react with fear. We feel that fear in our body, we feel it in our mind. And we can feel the body might be reacting as if the danger is actually happening in the here and now. While we only hear a story. If we want to fool someone and we come up with a story which is not true, that reaction in the body and mind is as if the story is true. Right? So this is something typical for human beings. So we, just by believing a story that we hear, our fight and flight reaction can get activated. Besides the hearing, we are also very susceptible for what others experience. For instance, when I see that somebody else is in danger, you know, I'm walking with my child on the road and then this truck is coming and I think, oh my God, you know, I want to pull the child, but at the same time, I feel the fear, maybe even more than the child, you know, or at least as much as the child. I feel that fear too. Oh my God, something can happen to this child. Even when it is not my child, I'm still scared when I see that others are in danger. Right? We are also different than animals in that when we are with a group of people, and many of these people react with fear, we automatically start to react with fear as well. For instance, we are in a group and we get news, oh, something has happened, you know, and we feel something has happened to others who maybe they are wounded, maybe they are in danger, and we feel afraid. We are afraid because they are afraid. We might be afraid because we think we might be in the same danger. But if I'm in that group of people and I know that actually there is no threat outside there, and I know that nobody has been wounded, and I know nothing is happening, they're just fooling the people. If everyone around me gets afraid, I might still get afraid. Is that true? Have you ever thought about that? If everyone is running one direction, you know, somehow automatically we start running that direction. Even if we know that's the wrong direction, but we cannot help ourselves. The body is just doing that. You know, because we are social animals. And so when we are together, somehow the body and the mind, they react in a similar way. So that is a beautiful quality to have in the sense that it makes us the social beings that we are. It makes that we can feel what other people are feeling. It makes that we empathize with people who are in danger and who are in fear. But it makes us also very vulnerable. Right? It makes that we can lose our independent way of being when we are in a group and the whole group starts to react in a certain way. And it is good to know that we react in that way, that we understand what is going on. And within that also already we can find some solutions about what to do when fear arises in the mind. Right? If I'm part of a very fearful family and I go to family gatherings and they're all talking about these events that are causing so much fear to arise in the mind, and I'm starting to react with them, I might decide that I'm not going to go so often to these family gatherings, you know, because I just get scared While I know there is actually no reason to be afraid. Right? But we get later to the things that we can do for fear. So fear is a natural reaction that protects us from direct danger, right? That is, and that fear, it is not that we want to do anything about that fear, right? Nor do I think that we can do anything about the fear. If there is direct danger, we need to react. We need to jump away. Right? If the car is coming, we need to jump away. We're not trying to eliminate that type of fear. But the fear of what we think might happen, the fear of what we are told might happen, the fear of anything that is related to what is not happening in the present moment, that fear can be very paralyzing, can give us the feeling that we get disturbed, we cannot do anything about it, we don't know what to do about it, and that fear is not really useful when it is all the time in the mind. Right? So we're going to look at what can we do with that fear. So what is the cause of our fear? And I think I mentioned a little bit last time, and we spoke about, and if we speak about the second noble truth, what is the cause of all our suffering, then the Buddha says that is karma and delusions. So when we apply this to fear, then we can say, okay, what is the karma to experience fear? The karma to experience fear means that we have created actions in the past that have as a result the experience of fear today. And so we can think about what kind of actions are the actions that cause fear to arise in our mind in the future. And then we can think about actions that we have done that instill fear in the mind of others. Right? When we scare people, sentient beings, that fear that these sentient beings have, a similar imprint is planted into our mind. And so that fear will ripen one day for us. And often the actions that cause fear in others is the actions that are harmful to others. Right? And so we can think about all the 10 non-virtuous actions, the 10 harmful actions. And these are all ways that we can cause fear in others. So what can we do about that? What can we do about the karma? We can be sure that we all have created actions that caused harm to others, right? There is no one that has never done any negative action. We all have done, I think Robina says that we have done everything. All of us have done everything in the past. And so the seeds of these actions, which can ripen into a result, which is an experience, which can be a fearful experience, they are all waiting in our mind for the right causes and conditions to arise. And so what can we do today so that these seeds cannot ripen into fearful experiences? So one thing that we can do is the Vajrasattva practice, the purification practice with the 4 opponent powers. So we can sit down every evening and we can think about the fear that we must have caused to others. And one way of knowing that we have created these actions is by the fact that we are experiencing fear today. And so we can say, okay, today I was a bit scared of this and this and this. That must mean that I have done something similar to others. And so I'm going to collect, or I'm going to bring to mind all the time, every time that I have created such an action in relationship to others. I call that to mind, and then I have deep regret about these actions by understanding that having done these actions, they come back to me in the form of fearful experiences. And then independence on that strong regret, I visualize all sentient beings around me. I visualize the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. I take strong refuge in the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and I generate bodhicitta. Bodhicitta being the mind that wishes to benefit all sentient beings. And then I apply the remedy by doing my mantras. And then at the end of the practice, I make a very strong resolution that I never, ever, ever want to do these actions again. Or if that is too difficult, I can make the determination that at least I'm going to do it for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 1 hour, 1 day, however long you can do that. Right? And so by doing this purification practice, what we do is we make the potential of the seed that is already in our mind, the potential of that seed becomes less big. So even when the causes and conditions arise that potential ripens into an experience, the experience will not cause as much suffering as it will when we do not do any purification practice. So that's what we can do with the actions that we already have done. Karma. Then another way of working with karma being one of the causes of our suffering, karma being one of the causes of the fear that arises in the mind. These seeds of negative actions that are, these potentials of negative actions that are in our mind stream, they can only ripen when the right causes and conditions arise. And the causes and conditions for negative imprints to arise into an experience is when we engage already in negative actions or when there are a lot of delusions in the mind. So by keeping the mind more quiet, more calm, by having our mind focus on virtuous actions, it is less likely that the seeds of negative actions can ripen today. You know, so keeping the mind on virtue is another way that negative seeds cannot ripen. So that's all I can say about karma. And then we can talk about the other cause of suffering, which is our delusions. And if we think about what is the main cause of suffering, if we think about karma and delusions, then it is always said in the teachings that delusions is the main cause of suffering. Why is that? Because delusions is what triggers the karma to ripen. And even if I remove all the seeds from my mental continuum, even if I purify all these potentials for suffering, if there are still delusions in the mind, I will create, under the influence of delusions, new negative actions, which will ripen into more suffering in the future. But if I can remove all the delusions from my mind, even if there are millions of seeds in my mind waiting there to ripen into a suffering experience, they cannot ripen because the delusions that make these seeds ripen are not present anymore. So when we can do something about the delusions, that is really the most powerful way of doing something to counteract negative feelings from arising in the mind. All right. So when we reflect on all the delusions that we have, you know, our attachment, our aversion, jealousy, pride, and any delusion that comes from that, they all go back to the same root. And the root is the self-grasping mind. The self-grasping mind within the Prasangika school, and I'm not sure if I'm saying something that you don't know, the school that has the most subtle view on how things exist within the Tibetan Buddhism. Within the root cause of all our delusions is the self-grasping mind, and that self-grasping mind itself is a delusion as well. But it is the most subtle delusion to find. If we understand the self-grasping mind and what the mind is grasping at, and why it is a delusion. Delusion means it is not in accordance with reality. You know, if we really understand that, that is the best antidote to experiencing fear. Because when fear arises in the mind, there is straight away this grasping at self. Right? We can feel that straight away. So when I know what to do in order to counteract that self-grasping mind, the fear will become less. True. From that self-grasping mind, we can react when there's fear in the mind, when the fear is holding on to that self, you know, or when that fear is arising in dependence on that self. We can react in dependence on that with aversion, you know, aversion for what is happening to us or for what might happen to us. For instance, we are very afraid that I'm going to lose my job. I'm afraid I'm going to lose my house, my wealth. I'm afraid I'm going to lose my health. I'm afraid I'm going to lose myself, me. I might die, right? When I feel that, there is a huge aversion. Oh, I do not want that. Right? So in dependence on fear, if we feel we're going to lose something or we might lose something, there is an aversion towards that. At the same time, there might be a strong attachment to what we need in order to survive. For instance, if I have the feeling, oh, there might be a lot of hunger, or I don't have enough energy to make myself warm, or I don't, then I'm going to collect. What do I need in order to be able to feed myself? What do I need in order to make myself warm? What do I need in order to have enough water? What do I need in order to have enough money? What do I need? That's the grasping mind. Right? So in dependence upon fear, there is strong aversion to what we might lose, and there is a strong attachment holding on to what we believe that we need in order to survive. But both that attachment and aversion are based on that I, that self, holding on to that self. What do I need to do to protect the self? What do I need to do in order to give the self what it needs to survive? True. So when I can lessen that grasping at the self, then also that attachment will become less strong and that aversion will become less strong. Right? So what I want to do today is first talk about that self and how we can approach that self or look at that self so that the grasping becomes less strong. And then next time we talk about, we can look into the reactions that we have of strong attachment, strong aversion, and how we can think about that in order to make the fear which is behind it less strong. You know, because when there is fear in the mind and we react with strong attachment, that strong attachment itself will feed the fear again. But if I can see that that fear is based on a self, and I can lessen that self, then the reaction of attachment will also be less strong. And then that will feed in less into the fear. And then the fear will not get triggered again and again. Is that, just let me check if that is clear. And if you have any questions during the teachings, feel free to put it in the chat, and I can sometimes look at that. And if there is something very urgent, please put up your hand, and I'm also happy to stop for that. All right. No questions so far? You're all good? All right. So we're going to look at the self-grasping mind today. So now I'm going to ask you to just imagine when we are scared, when you are scared, when you are afraid, how does the self appear to you? How would you describe that self? And maybe we can put a little bit on the chat for that, so that we can see how we can say the same thing all in a different way, you know. But if we can, so the self appears as solid, or the self appears as a heightened anxiety. So if you say that a heightened anxiety, Mary, what is the self? How would you describe the self that is experiencing that anxiety? How does that one feel? How does it feel? How does it appear to the mind? That self feels insecure. So that is how the self feels. But if you would have to describe what that self is, how would you describe that? It appears as being really existing. And the self as other and separate from the rest. The self as other. I don't completely understand that. You mean, what do you mean with the self as other? Definitely when the self strongly appears, it appears as being separate from everything else. And then appears as very other from other beings, right? From everything else. There is a separation, me and everything else. It isn't connected anymore. So we feel disconnected. Is that true? Do you all feel that? It feels as independently existing, independent of anything else, standing on itself, standing on its own feet, in its own power. So that self that appears, does that appear as being part of the body and the mind? Does it appear as something different from the body and the mind? Does it appear as something living inside the body and the mind, or something outside the body and the mind? How do you feel that? Something inside the body and the mind, because the body feels uncomfortable. Even if the body feels uncomfortable, we could feel that the body is uncomfortable, but then there is this I outside the body and the mind, almost, which feels really, really scared. And then there is this uncomfortable body with it. It feels like it is a part that is living inside. So it is separate, but at the same time it's inside. It appears to be living inside in the core of your being. And then Leslie says it takes over the body and the mind. So when something exists which takes over the body and the mind, it appears like an entity which is not the body and the mind, but which is in charge of the body and the mind. So some people say it really feels living inside. And maybe, Leslie, for you, it also lives inside, but then it is in control of the body and the mind, or it takes over the body and the mind. And so this self is like a little bit a strange entity, right? Because when we start thinking about it, it is like, it feels like it is living there. But then it is in control of the body and the mind. So it seems that like it is separate from the body and the mind. And sometimes it might feel that the body and the mind are controlling the self. And sometimes it might feel that the self is in control of the body and the mind. Sometimes it might feel as something different from the body and the mind, but then at the same time, it's inside the body and the mind. So what is it? Right? It's like, it feels so clear, and it feels we are so sure that there is this self inside us. But when we really start looking at it, it's like, what is it? What is it? And so I don't know about you guys, but then I have the feeling I actually do not know what it is. Right? It seems so clear, but when I start looking, it actually becomes very unclear. And when I start thinking about what am I actually saying when I describe it, it's weird. All right, so the Buddha says the self, even perceiving the self, perceiving, grasping at the self, is coming from our ignorant mind. Our ignorant mind is a mind that does not know reality as it is. And sometimes it is described as a veil. You know, it is a veil that is between our perception and reality itself. A veil that obscures us from seeing reality as it is. Sometimes it is called the sleep of ignorance, or we are blinded by ignorance. We can't see it as it is. If we would be able to see the self as it is, and we would start looking at it, it should become more clear the more we look at it, the more we analyze it. But when we start looking more close, it actually, I don't know, becomes more confusing. Like, huh? What? How is it? It's weird. Right? It can appear so clear when we are afraid. And then we look, what is that actually? And we cannot, it becomes more and more unclear. And so the fact that it becomes more unclear shows that we cannot see it. Shows that we have an ignorance for seeing it as it is. So for one side, we are blinded by ignorance. Due to our ignorance, we cannot see reality as it is. But it is not only that we cannot see reality as it is. What we are doing is we are making up a reality. We are making up something that doesn't exist in actuality. So we are creating a kind of hallucination. We are fantasizing something that we believe, or it appears to us as if it exists, while in actuality it does not exist. So when we say we cannot see reality as it is, that means that we cannot see that this self that we think exists independently, we cannot see that that self doesn't exist. That is the not seeing. I cannot see that it doesn't exist. but I do see something. And that something that I see is actually completely made up by the mind. That what I see is a fantasy, is like a hallucination. And I believe that that is the reality as it is, and I project that onto reality. So I'm creating something that is not there. And what I create with the mind is totally opposite of how the self that does exist, how that self exists in actuality. So when we talk about the self, there is a self that appears to us, which doesn't exist. And then there is a self that does exist. For us, these two are the same thing. They always come together. They always come together. And when we start looking at that self, then they both seem to disappear. And so this is how the mind works at the moment. You know, the self that does exist is so subtle that we cannot perceive that in and of itself. We see when we speak about the independent self, we call it also the inherently existent self. We see that self. And then part of that self is the conventionally existent self. So the inherently existent self doesn't exist. But the self that does exist is so subtle that I cannot see it. So when I start thinking about the inherently existent self, and I start to analyze, and I start to realize it doesn't exist, they actually disappear both. And then it looks like nothing is there. And then we need to analyze and say, but even when there is nothing there, it doesn't mean that no self exists. There is a self, but that self only exists as a conventionally existent self, as an imputation by the mind, as something that I label by the mind, as a name given, independence on the body and the mind. So Sunny says, what about a car about to hit you? Is that fear a hallucination? Fear is not a hallucination. Fear is a feeling, and that feeling is real. That feeling is happening in the present moment, right? So that feeling of fear is real. But the reaction, the self that we are holding on to, the self that we are afraid of, or that we are fearful for, that self that we hold on to, that is a hallucination, right? That doesn't exist in actuality. So therefore, should we let us hit by a car? No, we should still jump back, because we do exist, right? But that entity, what we feel inside the stomach, or inside, sometimes we can feel it in the heart, right? That this one, that cramping, that one is not the I, is not the self, but it appears as being the self. All right. So we see something that is not there, and we cannot see that which does exist. So this makes it a little bit difficult to really. So then in order to realize then how does the self exist, we first need to realize how the self does not exist. We need to realize what is that fantasy that we are projecting onto the self. What is that fantasy that appears as being the self? When we know what the fantasy is, we can say, oh, that is not there. Only after that we can say, then what is there? Right? So that is what we do when we realize selflessness. We first need to realize the emptiness of that independent self. We need to realize the emptiness of the inherently existing self. We need to say that what I believe exists is not there. Then we can see what is there. Right? So first we realize emptiness, then we realize how things do exist. When we realize the emptiness of the self, you can imagine that the fear that arises in dependence on that self becomes less strong. True? So what I understand is that realizing emptiness is the best way of getting rid of the fear. If we get rid of that fear, does that mean that we will not jump anymore when a car is about to hit us? No, we will keep jumping, don't worry. That jumping goes so fast, that goes beyond our rational mind, that goes beyond anything. We will jump. And they actually say when we eliminate the fear that we hold on to, that is too much, you know, that is not realistic, that is made up by our mind. When we remove that, actually these automatic reactions that we need to have on a day-to-day basis when real dangers to our body appear, they will become much quicker, much faster, much more accurate. Right? They now can become a little bit too tense and therefore not reacting as good as they could due to holding on to more fear than is necessary. So we impute or we project qualities onto the self. We create a self that in actuality doesn't exist. We impute, we fantasize, we add the qualities of being independent, of being more permanent, and of being unitary, right? The self appears as one thing. There is this one entity inside us, which is the self. There's not, we have two. Some people might have that, but in general, we do not have two entities. What we say, well, I have a self here and I have a self here. This self reacts like this self is different. We always have the feeling this is the same self that we are feeling. Sometimes we feel it in the heart, sometimes in the stomach, sometimes in the belly, but it's still the same self. And it is one self, right? So we see the self as something that is one. We see it as something that is independent from anything else, separate from anything else. And we see it as something that is not changing, something that has a quality of being always the same. True? That self is projected by the mind, is made up by the mind. It's not something that we are consciously doing. It's something that intuitively happens. And we project such a self onto everything else that exists. We give everything else in the world an identity, right? A cup is a cup, and we think that a cup has some cupness so that we can call it cup. Same with the table. When we look at the table, it looks like there is an entity which is different from all the parts together, which makes it a table. When we look at our car, there is something in the car which is different from all the parts, which is a kind of carness, which makes it, this is my car, as if it has its own entity. True? We can think about my car, and there is something about my car that makes it my car. That identity is coming from my mind. It's not coming from the car. But the main place where we need to look at when we are in fear is at the self, independence on which that fear arises. We don't have to look at the car or the cup or the table or any other object in the world or other sentient beings. The main one is the self. Right? The fear grasps at the self. It's almost like the fear grasps at the self. It's not really true. But due to fear, when we experience fear, the self-grasping becomes stronger. All right. Can we go here? So the self doesn't exist in the way it appears to us. So this is difficult to listen at, right? And I try to make it as simple as possible. But try to follow it with your brain, even if you can't get it completely, but it is extremely useful to do. And even if you can't get it completely, I can promise you that you will notice the effects. All right, because part of your mind will understand. So what we need to look at is how the self appears to us. And then we need to think about, but does it exist like that? Or what would it mean if the I would exist like that? And then we're going to see if it is possible for the I to exist like that. Right? And then when we look into that, we can come to the conclusion, no, impossible. And we can come with many reasons why it is impossible. And when we see all these reasonings, then the grasping mind will become naturally less grasping, less holding on, because you know it's not true. And why do we need to do it like that? We are emotional beings, right? We always react emotionally. I like this, I don't like this. I have attraction to this, I have aversion to this. We do that automatically in every moment. Right? We cannot change that. We cannot say, oh, I can like it, right? We need to work on it in order to like something that we in first instance don't like. When we feel aversion to something and it is not so helpful to feel aversion, we need to do something with the mind in order to change that aversion. But if we do nothing, then we just follow what we like and we move away from what we do not like. True? In Buddhism, we say when pleasant feelings arise in the mind, attachment follows. When unpleasant feelings arise, aversion follows. And so we follow our feelings the whole day. Right? Why would I do something that I don't like? We won't. Why would we go somewhere, drink a coffee that we don't like? We go to the bar where there is coffee that we do like. Right? Why would we eat in a place what we don't like? We go somewhere where there is good food so that we like it. This is how the mind works. We are emotional beings and we use our brain to justify our emotional, to justify us following these emotions. So I go to this place to eat. I don't say because I like it, you know. I know I say, no, they make really good food and they use only organic. And the guy who's working there, he's really hygienic and he's doing this. And I can see everything. Many, many, many reasons we can come up with. But the actual reason why we go there is because we like it, because it feels so good. Right? So we use our brain to justify our actions. But our actions are actually only coming from attachment and aversion. Following our feelings. So what we do when we're going to think about the self, what we're going to do, we're going to use our rational mind in order to reprogram that emotional reaction. So, and according to Buddhism, that is actually the only good way to use your mind, to use the brain, to use the reasoning consciousness, to do something about that emotional behavior that we have. As long as we react emotionally, you know, we are constantly creating karma. And so the only reason to free ourselves from that is by applying the reasoning mind and then investigating with that mind our emotional reactions. Or investigating with that rational mind, investigating the nature of reality, how we believe in it. And then see the way I believe in it, it cannot exist like that. It's impossible. Reality cannot be like that. I believe it. When I see it, it looks like that. But when I think about it, it cannot be like that. So when we use the mind in that way, it becomes extremely powerful in that we can see things are not like that. And when I know things are not like that, I will not take my reactions that seriously anymore. When I don't take the reactions that seriously, I won't follow them blindly. I get some space from them and I can say, yeah, even if it appears like that, but I know, you know, it's not good for me to do this. I know I'm creating a lot of suffering if I do that. I'm going to turn around. I'm going to go the other way. All right. In order to, and when we use that reasoning consciousness, we start to develop the wisdom mind. And I'm not saying that wisdom is not intuitively. Sometimes wisdom is very intuitively, you know, we have collected wisdom in past lives, which might now be in our mind as an intuitive mind that knows. But if we want to change our or develop the wisdom mind more, we need to use our rational mind. We cannot rely upon the wisdom that already was developed, right? We want to get a little bit further than that. So we need to apply reasoning, and in order to apply the reasoning, I'm just thinking, what time did we start? Was that?
We started at 10:30, Venerable, and we're finishing at 12 o'clock.
Oh my gosh. I'm already speaking for an hour now. All right. I'm going to give you then the essence, right, that you can think about this week. So in order to go to how we apply the reasoning, we normally rely upon Nagarjuna, we rely upon Chandakirti, and especially Chandakirti has not exactly created, but he has written down the sevenfold reasoning. And the sevenfold reasoning is a reasoning that we use in order to prove to ourselves that that self cannot exist as an independent, unitary, permanent entity. This is what we need to prove, right? The way it appears to us, it cannot exist like that. And so that sevenfold reasoning, if we want to bring, we can bring that back to two reasonings that we need to apply. And the other five actually can be part of these two. So I will tell you these two. And the other 5, we maybe leave them. If you know these 2, then you know enough. So the first reasoning is, if the self were to exist the way it appears to us, as an independent, unitary, permanent self, then it would be either one with the body and the mind, or it would be an entity separate from the body and the mind. There is no third possibility. And so you need to first think, is this true? You know, if an inherently self were to exist, it can only exist. Inherently means separate from everything else, independent from everything else. So when it is independent of everything else, it should be either independent of the body and the mind, or it should be something completely the same with the body and the mind, but it is then different from everything else. True? So if the self were inherently one with the body and the mind, if it would be completely the same with the body and the mind, then there are many reasons that we can bring up that shows that this is not true, that the self cannot exist like that. For instance, if the self would be inherently one with the body and the mind, my body and mind have 5 aggregates. Right? If the self is one with 5 aggregates, there should be 5 selves. Or I should say, well, if there is only one self, there can only be one aggregate. I cannot have 5 aggregates and then only one self. Then the body and the mind are not exactly the same. If my self would be inherently one with the body and the mind, that would mean that there is no relationship between former and later moments. If my self exists inherently and it is one with body and mind, one of the qualities of inherent existence is that there is no relationship with anything else. So then also my inherent existent self at this moment has no relationship with the inherently existent self at the next moment. And if it is one with the body, then my inherently existent body at this moment has no relationship with the inherently existent body in the next moment. And same for the mind. And so that would also mean that if I do an action, that my action has no relationship to the result that comes from that. My actions become inherently existent actions. And so no relationship with the result, which means that I could meet with results of actions that I have not performed. Or it could also mean that I do a lot of virtuous actions, but I will never experience the result of that. It would also mean that if my body and my mind and myself would exist inherently, it could mean that I die or that I do not die, but already get reborn. You know, because there is no relationship between the self and the body and the mind. Oh no, there is a relationship between the self and the body and the mind. Let me think, how was that? One would be reborn without dying. Also, taking rebirth is the result of karma. And so that result could already ripen without me even having died before. Anyway, this is something that Chandakirti describes, and you have to twist your mind in order to understand what he's saying. if for me there is no relationship between actions and results, I would have to say there is also no relationship between the self in this body and the mind and the self in previous lives in the body and the mind. So I would not be able to remember any past lives because there's no relationship there. And we know that many people remember their past lives. If the body and the mind were one with the self, inherently one with the self, my body is substantially existence. It is a substance, right? So then the self also would have to be a substance. But we'd never say that, right? That the self is a substance. It might sometimes feel like a substance, but when we then look for it, we cannot find that. It would also then mean if the body is a substance, then the mind also would have to be a substance, then the self. And so then when I die, then everything is died, right? I would not be able to be reborn. And so when we think about that, I don't know, my mind always goes like, huh, what are you talking about? You know, and because it is so weird, it actually already shows that the self cannot exist like that. We're trying to understand, what does it mean if the self is inherently one with the body and the mind? And then it means this and it means that, and you think like, what are you talking about? Because it is not like that. And we can almost not imagine what it would mean, because the self does not exist inherently being one with body and mind. And so the other thing that we can think is then, does it exist as something different from the body and the mind? Right? And sometimes the self appears like that. It is there, completely separate from anything else. So if the self was something different from the body and the mind, I could think about the self without calling to mind the body. The self should appear to the mind as something completely separate from the body and the mind. But when I think about myself, what arises first is always the body in my mind. When I think about somebody else, there is always the body that arises. I cannot think about anyone without their body and mind appearing to my mind. True? If myself would be inherently different from the body and the mind, I should be able to have an image of that self in my mind, which is completely separate from the body and the mind. But that's not possible, because the self depends upon the body and the mind. And so when I think about the self, or when I think about another person, first the body and maybe the personality appears to my mind. And then in dependence on that, the self appears, but never separate from the body and the mind. True? Then also, if the body and mind would be something inherently different from the self, the self and the body and the mind would be not related. They would be independent of each other, as if they function completely differently, as if they do not influence each other. And we know that that is not true. You know, we feel that self inside us. There is relation related to the body and the mind. When the self is upset, the mind is upset. When the self is upset, we can feel it in the body. They then sometimes appear as being the same, but at the same time, they appear as being separate. But we cannot say definitely they're inherently the same or they're inherently different from each other. Right? There are reasons that show that they cannot be inherently the same or inherently different from each other. And so then we can say, so such a self which exists as an independent, unitary, permanent entity cannot exist. That self that appears to us, that one doesn't exist. And so this is how we refute an inherently existent self. And then after that, we think, then how does the self exist? So we do that next time. Thinking the self doesn't exist doesn't make that it fades out of existence, or that something first existed and then suddenly it is gone. What it means is that we hold on to something that in actuality doesn't exist. And in dependence on what we hold on to, we experience feelings and we react to these feelings with attachment and aversion. And so the stronger we believe in that self, the stronger the feelings will be, the stronger the reaction to the feelings will be. And then due to that, the more suffering there will be. So the less grasping we have at the self, the more easygoing we become. The more we can deal with whatever is happening in our life. And we can see, you know, it's not that there is no fear, but it is not that we follow the fear. We can say, okay, there is some fear in my mind. Is this based on facts? Or is this just a feeling that arises? What are the facts? What can I do about the facts? How can I take care of myself in the best way? But I do not necessarily have to follow the fear in order to take care of myself. I would say, don't follow the fear to take care of yourself. Right? Then there's going to be panic. There is going to be following the group. Then there is going to be, and actually you're just following your emotional mind, which is not the most helpful mind, which always has been the cause of our suffering. And so this is a very difficult story, and I'm really sorry. I hope I haven't sent anyone away now. So when the self exists inherently, if it were to exist inherently, when we would look for it, we should be able to find it. I said it in the beginning, when we start looking into the self, it becomes more confusing. It is like, and so that shows that that self doesn't exist. So it says that if that self were to exist inherently the way it appears to us, then when we look for it, we should be able to find it, either within the body and the mind or either outside of the body and the mind. Right? If the self really exists inherently, we should be able to pinpoint it and say, there it is. If an inherently existent self exists, you will be able to find it. And so then one way that what we can do is we can meditate on the findability of the self. If the self exists, we should be able to find it either within the body or the mind or outside the body and the mind. And if we can't find it, we would have to say, oh, that self doesn't exist. And so although looking for that self is not the same as realizing emptiness, it can be very helpful to see for yourself, like, I can't find it. It's not there. Right? When you can see it is not there, you can maybe accept when it arises that it is not as real as you believe it is. And that can help you to react less strong to the feelings that arise in the mind. And that is what I had planned to do after, but I will leave a little bit of time for question and answer. Are you all with me today? Yes, Leslie.
Thank you so much for this teaching and this opportunity. I came to the class because I was experiencing a lot of fear around my relationship with my older daughter. She's out of the house now and living on her own. And it's difficult to be a mother and feeding someone every day, and then all of a sudden they're not there. I'm like, oh my God. It was interesting when I first got the notice about this class, because I'm a pretty fearless person. I don't have a lot of fear so much, but I was having such a struggle with my relationship with my daughter. And then I realized it was because I was afraid. I was afraid she doesn't have a father in her life. And I was afraid, did I teach her the right things? She's out there now. Like I wanted to be more connected with her. And then exactly what I've learned in the class, and obviously from the teachings of the past and studying Tibetan Buddhism, that I've been doing all the things. I've been self-grasping, why won't she call me back? My poor daughter's on a road trip across the country for work. And I'm like, why isn't she calling me back? Because she's driving, I couldn't see this thing because the fear was just really taking over me, and just afraid and manifesting all of these awful things that were going to happen to us in the future as a result of my failings. And so this morning I was studying over the notes from last week, and then it was like a movie I was watching. It was so much of a fantasy, and it was so unreal. I suddenly got to a point where it was like a movie I was watching. And then going back to the teachings of like the self only being made of non-self elements. And it was just like this feeling of like the possibility of even existing alive at the same time as my daughter is so wild, much less for her to karmically be my child in this lifetime. Like my fear of separation from her is so irrational. It doesn't matter if she calls me, it doesn't matter if she ever calls me ever again, actually. You know what I mean? Like, it's okay. Like it's just this beautiful thing of like exactly all the things. And I'm just so grateful for this teaching and to feel like I'm coming out a little bit on the other side of this, which is going on for several months now already. And I know it's still work, and I have to, keep the practice. Thich Nhat Hanh says your life will be more or less beautiful depending on your practice. And so just to try and keep at it and keep undoing these knots and uprooting all of this. It's just causing my relationship with her to be worse, actually. It's just like just what you said about the grasping mind. The fear goes into the attachment, and the attachment exacerbates the fear. And
and with your attachment, you hold on to your girl and you say, you have to call me, and why didn't you call me? And
now she doesn't even want to talk to me, because all I talk about is like, why aren't we talking? It's like, but she's like, but we're talking right now. I just called you. It's crazy town.
Yeah.
So
and so when we have a lot of attachment, then the other person will just push us away, right? Because they feel constricted, and they feel like you should trust me and you should let me live my own life. But the fear can be so big that we cannot help ourselves, and we just keep acting in an irrational way, right?
Yeah.
And so we can wonder, like, if I follow now my fear, would that actually change her situation? right?
So that's a very interesting point, because this morning when I was reading, this is the book I'm reading right now, Transformation of the Mind by the Dalai Lama.
Mhm.
And so after I went over the notes from last week and did through all this self of made up of non-self elements and all those things and came to a much better place already, then of course I opened to the perfect teaching. It's always exactly what you need. And it said, we need to cultivate a compassion that is powerful enough to make us committed to bringing about the well-being of others, so that we are actually willing to shoulder the responsibility for making this happen.
Mhm.
And so once I realized that my daughter might need things from me right now that I'm not even seeing because I'm so worried about what I'm getting, and then to accept the responsibility to forget about that and meet her where she might be, will actually get me what I want, which is to feel closer to her.
Mhm.
You know, so it's hard, and it's, you know, just because I have this beautiful moment of grace today doesn't mean I might not fall back into it later, but I have the tools now, like you're saying, these tools to really keep undoing that. And maybe someday it will start to just be like, you know, like I said, how amazing would it be for all of us if I never felt like she ever needed to call me again? And then if she does,
Well, or if I don't have a grasping for her to call me when I want it,
yeah,
you know, but
right.
it is not that I have to give up that she's ever going to call me, right? You don't want to give that one up. It's like, what it can be that she's not going to call you for a while. So how can I be okay with that? But it's not that we're going to think, oh, my daughter is never going to call me and I need to be okay with that. You know, that's a little bit extreme, I think.
Okay, thank you. Because I don't want to have to live like
you don't
that,
have to give that up, but you want to give up your fear of wanting it to happen when you want it to happen. Things do not happen when we want it, right? Things happen when it is the right time for them to happen. And so when you separate from your child, you need to, you have to allow that separation to happen. And that separation is unpleasant. And it is a finishing of a period of time that was, maybe the time was very beautiful with her and was very fulfilling for you. And so you're stepping now in something new in your life. And so allowing that old to go, that old life that you had with her to go, and then making place for a new relationship with her, a different type of meeting and being with her. And you do not know exactly how that's going to look like. Right? But it's going to be new. And that space that is going to be available is also going to bring you something new in your life, which is separate from your relationship with your daughter. And if you can let your daughter really go, that doesn't mean she's going to get out of your life. That means that the quality of your relationship is changing. She's much more herself. And therefore you can become much more the person you are without being a mother. Being mother becomes less big function in your life than it was before. And so because of that, there will be space for something else to come into your life. So letting her go. The more we let it go, you know, then trust that she will come back when it is the right time. And it will be less than it was before. But it doesn't, maybe the quality of being together is much more beautiful. And it will be different because she will be more an adult and less a child. And you will be less a mother to her and more maybe a good friend or a mentor or a guide. Right? So things are changing and allowing that change to happen. The grasping mind doesn't want to change, right? I want it to be as it was. So allow the change to happen. Impermanence is at work.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So I see that it is time, but I do want to do a little meditation if that is okay. Would that be all right? If you feel like it is too much, you can say bye-bye and come back next week, and you can see the meditation on when it is posted on YouTube. Right? But maybe some people would like to do the meditation on the non-findability of the self, and I will try to limit it to 10 minutes so that you have a little taste, and you can repeat this meditation as much as you want. And I myself find it very helpful to not take that self so seriously that appears to us. All right. Let's do that. And then next time we're going to look into more things that we can do when the fear arises, which are not directly attacking the self-grasping mind, but which are more helping us with the attachment and the aversion that arises in the mind, and how we can be with that in a way that it is not taking us over, that we are not following that blindly, but that we check, is this really wise to do? Is this the best thing that I can do? Okay. Now let's do the meditation. And for that, make sure that you sit comfortably. Whether that is on the chair or on the floor, on a cushion. And even if you feel that you want to sit on the couch, that's fine too. The main thing that we want to happen is that the mind is fresh and awake, that the mind is observing what is going on, that the mind is in the present moment, mindful of what is happening and alert in that it is constantly checking that it is still present at this moment. And then let go of all the thoughts and the thinking that have arisen because of the contemplation that we just did. If you don't get a reasoning, it's totally fine. Just let it go. If you do get the reasoning, don't hold on to it. Just let it go. And be aware of your body and your mind. And so then we reflect on one little thing that I said before, which is that if the self were to exist in the way we feel it exists, which means that if the self were to exist inherently, then the more we would look for it, the clearer it should become. When we look for it, we should be able to point at something that we can call, this is the I. We should be able to find the I or the self. if the self were to exist inherently, we should be able to find it either within the body and the mind or separate from the body and the mind. There is no other possibility. Contemplate that and check whether what I'm saying is true. So then let's look for that self. First of all, let's look for the self within the body. And so if the self would be findable in the body, we should be able to detect it somewhere. We should be able to point at something within the physical structure and say, that is the self. And so go to the place where you, when the self appears to you, where you feel it in your body. And it can feel quite physical. And when you feel that, then wonder, like, what is that self? If it is physical, what is it? And within the physical body, we have all these structures. We have the skin, we have the muscles, we have the blood, we have the bones, we have the ligaments. Try to feel then what kind of structure is this self? What is it made up of? For instance, if you feel that the self is in your stomach, then you can say, is the self the stomach? Or is it inside the stomach? And if it is inside the stomach, how would that be? You know, if the stomach is like a sack, is it inside the sack? And then where is it? And what kind of structure is it? And so you look deeper and deeper and deeper into the physical structure to really identify that self as being part of the physical structure. And maybe you can observe that the more you try to pinpoint it, then actually the less clear that feeling of self or that image of self becomes, as if it disappears right in front of you. So the fact that it disappears or becomes less clear is a sign that that self does not exist inherently as part of the body. If the self were to exist as part of the body, if it would exist inherently within the body, then surgeons would have to be able to find the self. When they operate on the body, they should come up with something and they say, this is it, this is the self. And so far, there hasn't been a surgeon who came up with that. And so from contemplating like that, we can come to the conclusion that we cannot find the self within the body, within the physical structure of the body. And then we can wonder then, maybe the self is part of the mind. Maybe we can find it in the mind, so we can check our consciousness. So if the I were to be part of your consciousness, then we should be able to pinpoint one of the consciousnesses as being the I. For instance, is it your eye consciousness or your ear consciousness? Or your taste consciousness? Sometimes we feel, oh, this is my real I. And we can feel that when there is strong attachment in the mind or strong aversion. Yeah, this is really me. But is that attachment the I? Is that aversion the I? Sometimes when the mind is very compassionate, we feel, oh, this is who I am. But then when that compassion disappears from the mind, also the I disappears from the mind. Some people say the real I is actually the observer, the witness. But what about the times that we sleep and there is no observer? Is there then no I? So when the I were to exist inherently, the way we experience it, and it would be part of the mind, then we would have to pinpoint something in the mind that we say that is the self, that is the I. And if you can find that, even if you can find that, then I would say, which moment of that part of your mind is the I? If something is really the I, then that part of the mind can never become something else. And so that is very difficult to pinpoint. It is not possible to pinpoint. But sometimes you might have the feeling, oh, I think I know what it is. But every part of your mind or the mind itself is constantly changing. And for something to be always the I, it cannot change. And so holding on to something, only that is the I, which is part of the mind, which is the mind, that would make that the mind cannot change. And we know that that is not true. And then we can search for the I as being something different from the body and the mind, something separate from the body and the mind, which means that we should be able to observe it outside of the body and the mind. So try to look for that. And so not being able to find a self within the body and the mind and outside of the body and the mind doesn't mean that the self doesn't exist. We can still say, my hand hurts. Or we can say, I'm feeling happy. I'm going home. That doesn't change. Not finding the I doesn't change that we can talk about the I. But it means that that I cannot be found, which means that that I does not exist inherently, independently. It does not exist in the way it appears to us. It is less concrete, less solid, less permanent, less independent than it appears to us. So focus on that conclusion. And then we can dedicate the merit. And we can think that all the positive energy that we have gathered today by listening, reflecting, meditating, that becomes the cause for the happiness and the well-being of all sentient beings. And we can read the prayers on the screen together to finish today's session. Due to these virtues, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow. And may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. Thank you so much for being here today. I know that it's a very difficult topic to hear, and I know that the first times that I heard about emptiness, I was like, I have no clue what they are talking about. But it never stopped me from listening again and listening again, and it is very, very difficult, but it is a very, very good exercise for the mind, you know, to get it out of this fixed idea that we have of the self. So please use it where you can. Don't feel discouraged. Right? I'm sure you got something. And what I would like you to do is next week, during the week, if you have time, to sometimes reflect on the existence of that self and check, you know, where is it? Can I find it? Can I pinpoint it? And when it disappears, then see what happens with the attachment and the aversion that arises in dependence on the self. Does that become less strong? Do you have more capacity to change the mind in something that could be more beneficial for you than following your disturbing emotions? Okay, if you have time, that would be great. And then next time we're going to talk about more, might feel more practical about attachment and aversion and what we can do in order that arise in dependence on the fear. And then how we can think to make them less dominant in our mind, so that also the fear will reduce a bit. Okay. And if there are any questions that come to your mind, please bring them to the next session and we can maybe start with that. Okay. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Venerable.
Thank you so much, Venerable.
And I'm looking forward to seeing you next week. You're very welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you.